Welcome to week 2, and this week's lecture is on standards and cognitive learning targets. Where do we begin with assessment? Well, we've got to start at the beginning and think about what are you trying to assess. If you were to go on a road trip, what would you need? You'd probably need a GPS or some type of road map to help you get where you're going. Standards and learning targets and objectives are those road maps to help us get where we're going when we teach. In your syllabus, you'll see a list of vocabularies. Most of these will be covered in today's lecture, but remember there is an extra vocabulary assignment that is worth up to 2 points extra credit in the course, and the template is located in the assignments folder. If you want to do that, you can download the template and simply type the vocabulary in, define it, and use it in a sentence. The page numbers here indicate which page number in the textbook the word is found on. So let's talk for a minute about standards, goals, objectives, and learning targets. These play key roles in both the instructional and assessment processes. They're the maps to where you want students to be able to learn and what you want them to be able to do. Standards come first, and then learning goals and objectives and targets follow. So first, let's talk about what is a learning standard. These are specific statements of what students should be able to know or do in major content areas. Often standards are composed and shared at the state or national level. If you're teaching in a school district, it's likely that your school is following sets of national standards or state standards. There are several types of learning standards. Learning standards that we're very familiar with cover content, what students need to be able to know. But some standards cover performance. What do they need to be able to do? For example, in music, we're more concerned with performance. Or we might be concerned that students are able to do research. Or we might be concerned that they're able to write. Standards can be developmental, especially at the younger ages, where we mark what students should be able to do cognitively and in terms of their motor development. And most standards are associated with grade levels. Why are they important? Well, as we said, they're the roadmap for what students will study and be assessed on. And from the standards, we create goals, learning objectives, learning targets, lesson plans, and finally assessments. You always start with standards. Here's an example of a New York State standard, grade 4 in science. Students will understand and apply scientific concepts, principles, and theories pertaining to the physical setting and living environment and recognize the historical development of ideas in science. Phew, that's a lot for a standard. If you pick apart that standard, that's way, way, way too much to teach in one lesson, in one unit, and possibly even in 1 year. There's a lot packed into that standard. We'll get into how to deconstruct standards so that they're more manageable, but for now I do want to point out that there is a standards folder located on the course materials page, and you will be required to plunge around in that this week to look for standards that interest you and that you might use in your edTPA project. So as I said, that previous standard is a lot, so it's important to sort of unpack standards so that you can follow the individual threads in them to develop appropriate units and lesson plans. So when you think about unpacking a large standard, it's important to think about what does the student need to know, what do they need to understand, and what should they be able to do. So for example, here's another standard. This is a kindergarten standard. Plan and conduct an investigation to compare the effects of different strengths or different directions of pushes and pulls on the motion of an object. So you can use, you early childhood people can probably visualize how this standard should be taught. You might have different size trucks loaded with different objects. Some are heavier, some are lighter, and have the students try to figure out that it takes more to push a heavier object than a lighter object. And what about if you pull? What about if you put it on different surfaces? What about if you change the direction? There's a lot in this standard going on. But if I take that standard and deconstruct it, I could come up with the following things that students must know, understand, and do. They must know it by the end of the lesson that pushes and pulls can have different strengths and directions. That's embedded in the standard. They must know that when objects collide, they push on one another and they can change motion. A bigger push or pull may make objects speed up or slow down more quickly, and all of this is sort of embedded in that standard. They must understand that simple tests can be designed to determine cause and effect because the standard asks them to conduct an investigation. And so they must be able to do that. They must be able to plan and conduct an investigation. So all of these things are sort of embedded in that big standard. And you have to get to the point where you can see what the standard is asking for. Do you have to teach all of that at once? No. You don't have to teach it in any one lesson. You don't even have to teach it in any one unit. But throughout the course of the year, you are expected to teach all of that standard. So, sort of going along with standards, we have learning goals. And these are broad statements of what students will know and be able to do over large blocks of instructional time. Learning goals aren't accomplished like standards. They're not accomplished in one lesson. They tend to be more general and therefore less measurable than other things, like when we get into objectives and then later learning targets. For example, a learning goal might be to understand and appreciate scientific knowledge. Well, you're not going to teach that in one lesson. And indeed, it's not as measurable because you can't see students' understanding, particularly. You certainly can't see their appreciation. Another goal might be to learn to think and study independently. Well, this is a goal we want for our students, but that goal might have to be developed over their 12 years or the 13 years of pre-K to 12 education. So learning goals, again, are large, broad statements, not as measurable, and developed over a very long time. More specific than a learning goal is an educational objective, and this is something that most educators are familiar with. This is a specific statement of student performance that should be demonstrated at the end of an instructional unit or lesson. So you might write an educational objective for a whole unit, or you might write it for one particular lesson. Think of it as an outcome. What do you want students to be able to know or to do? It should be very measurable. So how would you assess it? And when you're writing an educational objective, it's good and helpful to write by starting it with the words, student will be able to, and then follow that with an action verb. So student will be able to define the words, will list 3 adjectives associated with colorful writing, for example. Student will be able to, you might sometimes see abbreviated as SWBAT, and that just means student will be able to. Here's an example of an educational objective. Student will be able to multiply a 2-digit number by another 2-digit number. Student will be able to underline the verb and subject in a sentence. Do you see how this is very specific, focused on an outcome, and measurable? I can see right there whether students will be able to underline the verb and the subject. Whereas a goal, I couldn't see necessarily or measure students' appreciation for art. Now, it's important to be clear when you're writing learning objectives. Learning objectives are sometimes mistakenly stated in terms of actions to be taken. For example, students will be able to use a microscope. That might sound clear, but it is less clear about intended learning outcomes and does not point to the type of student assessment that would be suitable. So how do I know that they can use it? What would I need to be able to do? And so you need to start to think in terms of, what do you mean by use a microscope? Do you want them to be able to focus the slide? Do you want them to be able to use the lens to magnify it, certain magnifications? You need to be clear and specific when you're writing learning objectives. So instead, focus on specific outcomes by using action verbs. So this is a much clearer learning objective or set of learning objectives. Students will be able to identify the parts of a microscope, focus a microscope on a pre-prepared slide using the coarse and fine adjustment knobs, and use a microscope to make observations of a pre-prepared slide. Do you see how you could much easier assess each step there than just a general statement like use the microscope? Learning objectives are generally divided into three types. One is cognitive, and this is what you want students to know. This is the knowledge. So students will be able to name the US presidents or what you want them to do. Students will be able to conduct a scientific investigation, including creating a question, writing a hypothesis, gathering and recording data, and coming to a conclusion. Most of our learning objectives in education that we deal with are in fact cognitive. There's a second kind, though, affective. This deals with attitudes, interests, appreciation, motivation. Students will be able to work independently or demonstrate an increased appreciation of mathematics. So this is not focused on knowledge. This is focused on attitudes, their interests, and motivation, etc. A third category of learning objective is the psychomotor. This deals with what they can do physically, their perceptual and motor skills. So students will be able to tie their shoes is a type of psychomotor learning objective. Objectives and lesson plans must be standards based. So you begin with the standard, and then you design goals, although some people don't use goals, but go at least objectives to help students meet the standard. They need to be specific to the appropriate lesson and task in the lesson. They need to be clear, straightforward, and readable, and they need to be measurable. How will you know that students have met the objective? So the most important thing here, besides the fact that objectives need to be clear and measurable, is they need to be aligned with your standard. You can't have a standard that focuses on division and an objective that focuses on, for example, addition. Again, writing objectives, students will be able to, or SWBAT, and then give it an action verb. And the reason you want action verbs is you can see actions taking place, but you can't see students, quote, understanding, which is a perfect segue into this slide. Don't use the words know or understand in learning objectives. So it's too vague, and you can't really see them knowing or understanding something that's going on in their minds. You have to look for evidence of it. You want them to look that they demonstrate knowledge. So you use other words. So you use an action verb. So an action verb might be to identify, explain, match, differentiate. Anything that you can see them writing down or doing or performing using an action verb is appropriate, whereas if you say students will be able to understand, you can't really say that. Let's say you're teaching the 50 states, and you say students will be able to understand the names of the 50 states. Well, you can't see inside their mind to make sure they know that, but you can see lists. Students will be able to list the 50 states in alphabetical order is a learning objective. See the difference? Now, we've been talking a lot about objectives, but I'm going to add one little thing and turn it into a learning target. A learning target is a learning objective plus the assessment and the criteria for success, or sometimes we call it a target for success. What will you use to judge success? Let's take an example. Suppose the learning objective is that students will be able to identify an obtuse triangle. Okay, so what does that mean? What level do you want them to come up to? Do you want them to identify one obtuse triangle? Do you want them to identify two obtuse triangles? What if they have 10 obtuse triangles in front of them and they identify one? Maybe they just got lucky. I don't think you would qualify that as them really understanding the objective. So if we add targets or criteria for success, what's the level they have to come up to before you consider that they've mastered the standard? If we add that, we've changed our learning objective into a learning target. So students will be able to identify an obtuse triangle. There's our learning objective. It's underlined in the learning target. By drawing 5 different obtuse triangles in 5 minutes or less. Those are 2 criteria or targets we've set for success. So they have to draw 5 different ones in 5 minutes. I don't have to use the 5 minutes, by the way. I could just turn it into a learning target by saying students will be able to identify an obtuse triangle by drawing 5 different obtuse triangles. So I have to be able to say how I'm going to assess it and the level they're going to have to come up to for me to consider that they're successful. If I'm giving a quiz and it's worth 100 points, what's going to be the target for success? Students will be able to identify vocabulary terms with an 80% accuracy, might be my target for success. I've turned my objective into a learning target. So the only difference between a learning objective and a learning target is you include a criterion for success, a target for success. In addition to these terms, to get started with your edTPA assignment, which you're going to get started with this week, there are 2 others that you need to understand. One is called a central focus. Now, this is a term used by the edTPA, and it means a description of the important understandings and core concepts that you want students to develop within the learning segment. The central focus should go beyond the list of facts and skills, align with content standards and learning objectives, and address the subject-specific components in the learning segment. A learning segment is a set of 3 to 5 lessons that build one upon another towards a central focus with a clearly defined beginning and end. So think of the central focus as almost like a goal for the learning segment. Let's see what we mean by that. Let's take an example. Suppose the central focus of the 3 to 5 learning segment sets of lessons was that students would apply reasoning skills to conduct evidence-based research. So your related learning targets might be students define artifact and list 3 characteristics of an artifact. Students define inference and list 3 steps to take to make an inference about a historical artifact. And students make inferences about an artifact and write 2 inferences about the people that made the artifact. So all of these related learning targets are building towards a central focus that students are looking at evidence and they're saying, hey, okay, maybe these artifacts mean this about these people when they lived. So the learning target should build towards a central focus. It could be that each of these learning targets is one lesson, and you have a 3-lesson learning segment that build towards this central focus. So we'll be getting into that more in the edTPA assignment, which will begin this week. Also this week, there's a short assignment about differentiating between goals and objectives and learning targets. So after this lesson and your readings, you should be able to do that. There's also a discussion post. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Have a good week.